At the OAU Summit, beneath the sea of African flags, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood slowly and asked for a moment of silence. The hall fell quiet. In his hand, a handwritten list. Names of civilians killed in the recent protests in Kenya. Mothers, students, elders. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence he summoned echoed louder than any speech. "This is not about one country," he said quietly. "Today we are not separate nations." They expected policy proposals, trade deals, and rehearsed pleasantries. No one expected mourning. Ministers shifted uneasily. Some lowered their gaze. Others glanced at the empty seat meant for the Kenyan delegation. A translator whispered in French, "Il tient une liste." "What kind of list?" a delegate asked. She replied, "Names of the dead." The names appeared behind Traoré. No photos, no graphics, just row after row. Student, vendor, mother, unknown boy. The youngest, 6. The oldest, 72. His voice calm but eyes heavy, Traoré said, "We claim unity, but unity means nothing if we mourn in private. Today I choose to mourn in public." The Libyan envoy quietly set down his tablet. The South African finance minister closed her folder. Suddenly, numbers didn't matter. Faces did. "This isn't just about Kenya," Traoré continued. "It's about us. Our silence when our brothers bleed. Our delay when our sisters cry out. Our dignity scattered in the streets." Then a voice broke the tension. "Where is Kenya's seat?" It was the president of Ghana. No one answered. Traoré turned to the empty chair. "They were invited," he said. "They chose not to come." He let that hang in the air, like dust in sunlight. He flipped the page. These were not rioters. They were citizens. They marched for bread, not war. For justice, not chaos. And they were met with bullets. An aide stepped forward and gently placed a single bouquet in front of the Kenyan flag. That was the moment the room changed. The leaders didn't react as politicians. They reacted as people, as parents, as fellow Africans. A delegate from Senegal whispered, "This is no longer a summit, it's a funeral." Traoré went on, "We speak of sovereignty. Then let us begin by defending the sovereign right to live." His voice cracked, just slightly, enough to reveal the grief beneath the words. "For every African child who still believes in the promise of this continent, we owe them more than silence. We owe them action." At the back of the room, a young translator dropped her pen. She didn't wipe her tears. She didn't need to. No one was pretending anymore. Then came the line that would headline every broadcast by nightfall. "If African lives do not matter in Africa, then where in the world will they?" A pause. Then faint applause. Just a few. Most were too stunned to move. Across the continent, the moment spread. In Accra, a radio host cut the music to announce, "Something has shifted in Addis Ababa." In Nairobi, students watching from a cafe leaned closer. One whispered, "He said our names." In Bamako, a retired colonel murmured, "He's only 36, but he speaks like an ancestor." That night, the summit didn't end with applause or a gavel. It dissolved into quiet conversations, hushed phone calls, long stares into nothing. Some called it risky, others necessary, but no one would forget it. Because Captain Ibrahim Traoré hadn't given a speech, he had held up a mirror and dared Africa to look. The images didn't come from official briefings or news anchors. They came raw, through grainy live streams and unfiltered cell phone footage. A teenager sprawled on the pavement, his school bag soaked in blood. A mother shielding her child as tear gas filled the air. Students chanting peacefully until boots charged and rifles lifted. Kenya, long seen as stable, modern, a rising power, was cracking. Fuel prices jumped 30% overnight. Bread became a luxury. Youth unemployment hit historic highs. But beyond the statistics, it was about something deeper: humiliation, hunger, promises broken again and again. The protests started as whispers. Then they marched to Huru Park, tens of thousands strong, holding signs like, "Feed us, don't beat us." The government responded not with dialogue, but with batons, rubber bullets, and silence. One video went viral: a girl, no older than 12, walking with a plastic bag of groceries. An officer struck her without warning. She collapsed. The crowd screamed. That clip was everywhere: TikTok, Al Jazeera, BBC. In Dar es Salaam, elders shook their heads. In Lagos, students lit candles. In Cape Town, youth leaders demanded action from Parliament. And in Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré didn't sleep. At 11:47 p.m., he summoned his ministers to the command room. No one spoke at first. Screens glowed with footage from Nairobi. Defense Minister Yakuba looked pale. Finance Minister Fatima wiped her eyes. One frame showed a man in his 60s waving a white cloth seconds before tear gas dropped him. Finally, Traoré broke the silence. "How did we get here?" No one answered. He continued, "We cannot be silent, not when our brother's house is burning." The Minister of Communications hesitated. "Sir, it's Kenya's domestic matter." Traoré shook his head. "If we speak, let it be more than words. Let it be memory. Let it be truth." He called for a full security review across Burkina Faso. He told education officials to prepare messages for students, reminding them of their rights, their safety, their worth. Then, in his own handwriting, he composed a one-page directive addressed to every police station in the nation. If the people cry, listen. If they march, protect. If they bleed, kneel. Back in Nairobi, the crisis deepened. Police raided university dorms under the cover of darkness. Hospital corridors overflowed with the wounded. But then, something unexpected happened. Leaked messages from inside the Kenyan police force began to surface. One officer, anonymous, wrote, "We were told to treat them like terrorists, but all I saw were children." That message spread like wildfire. At the OAU Summit in Addis Ababa, delegates received routine briefings on the unrest. Most said nothing: too sensitive, too complex, too political. But Captain Traoré didn't see politics. He saw a pattern, a familiar one, the same cycle playing out in different capitals. People rise, governments respond with force, and Africa retreats into silence. A student in Accra tweeted, "If Kenya falls, who's next? We're all just one policy away from the same pain." In Uganda, protesters raised signs bearing Traoré's face, not as a ruler, but as a symbol, a voice, a memory, someone who didn't turn away. By morning, the headlines read, "Africa watches Kenya burn." But Captain Traoré was already preparing for the next summit session. He wasn't interested in polished statements or staged condolences. He was ready to name the moment, a tragedy and a test. At dawn, his motorcade left the presidential residence, and as he looked out at the quiet streets of Ouagadougou, he understood silence wasn't safety, silence was surrender. And Traoré was done surrendering. Later that day, a thin envelope arrived. No official seal, no crest, just a folded piece of paper delivered by a Ghanaian diplomat with tired eyes. "She asked me to bring this to you personally," the man said softly, placing it in Traoré's hands. "I told her I couldn't promise anything. She said, "Just try." Traoré nodded, slipped the envelope into his chest pocket, and walked back onto the summit floor. He didn't open it, not yet. But something had already shifted inside him, and he hadn't even read the first word. Hours later, alone in his quarters, he unfolded the letter. One page, blue ink, lined paper, slight tremors in the handwriting. "Dear Captain Traoré, my name is Mariam Wanjiku. I am the mother of a boy named Samuel. He was 16. He loved books, music, and telling bad jokes that made his sisters roll their eyes. He believed in this continent. He believed that leaders like you could change it. He was walking home from school. He'd bought bread, our favorite kind, with sesame seeds on top. It was the first warm loaf we'd had in days. He never made it home. A bullet tore through his chest. They said it was stray, but nothing about that day felt like an accident. He died holding bread. He died believing in something that didn't protect him. I know you don't know me, but I've seen you speak. I've seen how your people look at you, with hope. Please, Captain, speak for the sons who won't live long enough to vote. Speak for the ones who carry bread instead of stones. He was only 16, and he believed Africa could change. Sincerely, Mariam Wanjiku." Traoré sat motionless, the paper trembling in his hand. His thumb traced the name Samuel, again and again. He thought of himself at 16, already in uniform, already preparing for resistance. But Samuel had carried bread. That detail crushed him. By morning, he was at his desk tearing up his summit speech. Pages on infrastructure, trade, defense, all tossed aside. His advisors knocked, he waved them off. They brought coffee, he didn't touch it. Every word he now wrote came not from policy, but from pain. From Miriam, from Samuel, from every mother who buried her child without a gravestone, without justice, without even a name in the news. He wrote in silence, but his pen struck the page like thunder. By sunrise, the letter sat folded next to the podium. He wouldn't quote it. He didn't need to. The weight of it was already in his voice. When he returned to the summit floor that morning, something about him had changed. His stride, his expression, the quiet urgency in his eyes. There was no ceremony, no diplomatic mask, just purpose. He stepped up to the microphone and spoke only once before beginning. "I received a letter last night. It reminded me why I came here in the first place. So I've rewritten everything you expected me to say." The room froze. He didn't speak as a president. He spoke as a man who had just read the most honest page of writing in his life. And though he never said Samuel's name, everyone felt it. That same morning, in a small apartment in Nairobi, a woman turned on her radio. The signal crackled in and out, but she heard part of his voice. She smiled. Her son had been heard. At the summit, the Kenyan seat remained empty, neatly pushed in, a small flag upright on the desk. No papers, no coffee cup, just absence. And somehow that absence said everything. At first, no one noticed. The summit halls buzzed with whispers. Traoré's rewritten speech echoed behind closed doors. Camera crews replayed footage again and again. Some applauded, some hesitated, others stayed silent, afraid of what they now saw too clearly. And then finally, someone asked the question aloud. "Where is Kenya?" The delegate from Senegal turned to the empty seat and frowned. The name had been on yesterday's roll call, but this morning it remained unsigned. An aide from South Africa leaned over and whispered, "He walked out last night after reading Traoré's draft." Others disagreed. "He was never meant to come. Nairobi told him to sit this one out. Too much heat back home." But the reason didn't matter. What mattered was the chair, and the silence around it. No one moved it. No one dared to fill it. It sat like a wound in the room. During speeches, delegates kept glancing at it, some by accident, others on purpose. When Traoré returned from a press briefing, his eyes found the seat instantly. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Everyone saw that he saw it, and the weight in the room shifted again. Ghana's President Akoto was the first to speak, his voice calm but sharp. "We gather here to build something greater than ourselves, but when one of us turns away, we must ask, what did they see that we refuse to see? What truth felt too sharp to face?" He never said Kenya. He didn't need to. In newsrooms from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, cameras zoomed in on the chair. Commentators spoke in hushed tones. No statement, no delegate, no explanation. But back in Nairobi, the image landed like thunder. In Parliament, an opposition MP held up a photo of the chair. "This is the symbol of our silence," she said, "of our shame." Outside, protesters returned to the streets. One sign read, "If you won't sit at the table, we'll stand in the streets." Another showed just a chair. One word beneath it: cowardice. Back at the summit, the atmosphere had changed. Trade agreements gave way to reckoning. Ethiopia's delegate stood and said, "We've built walls with words. Maybe it's time we tear them down with truth." Still, Nairobi said nothing. The foreign ministry went quiet. The president's office gave no statement. And that silence began to speak louder than any speech ever could. Traoré didn't address the chair publicly, but later he told his press advisor, "That empty seat will be remembered longer than half the men sitting here today." Eventually, a summit official placed a folded note on the desk, a formality. But the note was blank, a placeholder, waiting for a name that wouldn't return. As the day ended, delegates began to drift from the hall. Some paused by the chair, one touched its edge, another simply nodded, as if paying respect. A delegate from Sierra Leone whispered, "That's where the future should have sat." And miles away, in a small apartment in Nairobi, Miriam Wanjiku watched the broadcast alone. She leaned forward, staring at the chair. "They couldn't show up for you, Samuel, but the world saw." Then she turned off the TV and lit a candle by the window. And across Africa, the empty chair kept speaking. They had come expecting charts and logistics, trade volumes, border corridors, export pipelines. But when the velvet curtain lifted, the screen showed something entirely different. No borders, no flags, no capitals, just faces. Thousands of them, stitched into a single digital wall. Displaced farmers in the Sahel, children waiting in overcrowded clinics, journalists who vanished in Eritrea, mothers digging wells in the dust of Somalia, fishermen pushed from the shores of Senegal. Each photo taken by local photographers, each story submitted by aid workers in schools. The hall went silent. Traoré stepped forward, no speech in hand, just a question. How do you govern a continent you've never walked in pain with? No one answered. He let the image speak first. Then he pointed to a boy at the bottom corner, barefoot, holding a sibling under a plastic tarp. He lives on land rich in gold, but he eats once a day. Another photo, an elderly woman holding a faded picture. She prayed for justice, she got silence. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. Every eye in the room was now locked on the display behind him. This is the Africa no summit agenda includes. but this is the Africa that wakes up every day. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. Traoré walked alongside the display, pausing at a cluster of images marked not by geography, but grief. Here we buried 42 people after foreign militias passed through. No cameras, no headlines, but they were ours, Africans. Then he turned to the assembly. Unity is not a slogan. It's a burden. It's a promise not to look away, especially when the cameras are off. Suddenly, the Algerian infrastructure minister stood. Her voice shook. "Captain, where did you get this map?" Traoré replied, "From the people, from classrooms, clinics, camps. They sent their stories. I just listened." The projection changed. The same faces, but now animated. Hot zones blinked red. Displacement figures scrolled. Drought regions shimmered in orange. Internet blackouts pulsed across the map. But it wasn't data. It was memory. Microphones unplugged, lenses capped. Journalists shuffled out. But inside the hall, no one moved. Because the real meeting was just beginning. Traoré remained seated, hands folded, eyes calm but piercing. He had barely stepped away from the podium before a request came. Speak again, off the record, behind closed doors. Not from his staff, from the heads of state themselves. Some wanted clarity, others cover, but all needed more. The room was smaller now, outer rows empty. The Kenyan chair still sat untouched at the edge of the semicircle. Traoré stood again, no microphone this time. He didn't need one. "I know what some of you are thinking," he said. "That I embarrassed this union, that I brought emotion where there should have been strategy, that I crossed a line." He paused. "Maybe I did, but only because that line should never have been drawn where silence begins." The Malian president leaned forward. The Ghanaian delegation exchanged glances. The room was tense, but not hostile. Wounded. Open. Traoré didn't name names. He didn't need to. "Justice," he said slowly, "must not be outsourced." The words echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "We bring in consultants to write our laws. We hire foreign firms to audit our elections. We let outside forces train our police, build our schools, even define our culture. And then we wonder why our children feel foreign in their own countries." He turned slightly, his hands opened. "I'm not saying help is wrong. I'm saying forgetting ourselves is." The president of Chad shifted uneasily. The Ivorian vice president scribbled something in her notes. The Senegalese ambassador, usually composed, looked shaken. Not offended, just reflective. Traoré walked the floor slowly, not pacing, but with intent. He wasn't there to shame them. He was there to wake them up. And one by one, they began to realize he wasn't just speaking to the room. He was speaking to history. Justice, he said, must not be imported. We must build it. He didn't accuse. He didn't point to shame. He simply gestured gently to the center of the room, as if grounding them all. Justice must begin at home, with truth, with sorrow, with courage. The word sorrow landed with unexpected weight. It wasn't a word typically heard in summit halls, but it cut deep. Sorrow because they had failed. Courage because they had to admit it. Truth because without it, their unity was just theater. A delegate shifted as if to speak, but thought better of it. The silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was sacred. not enforced, but earned. Traoré's voice lowered, but carried even stronger. Some of us will return to headlines, some to protests, some to applause. But none of it matters if we cannot look in the mirror and recognize the people we serve. He began to walk back toward his seat, but paused beside the still vacant Kenyan chair. He rested a hand lightly on the desk and said, "This chair is not empty. It's overflowing with everything we didn't say." And then he sat. No applause, just breath, just stillness. It was Ghana's President Akato who finally broke the silence. He rose, not as a politician, but as a man changed. "Captain, you reminded us why we're not just leaders, we are custodians. And this house we share, it's cracking." Others slowly nodded. A few stood, but there were no more speeches. Just presence. That night, as the summit hall emptied, some aides scrambled for damage control. But others stayed behind, alone, quiet, staring not at papers, but at the space Traoré had filled. One Rwandan delegate passing the Kenyan chair paused. He touched the armrest and whispered, "We heard you." No camera caught that. Some truths don't need recording. They just need remembering. The next morning, the atmosphere was different. Delegates didn't stride in. They entered slowly, not with the rhythm of power, but the weight of reflection. The events of the day before still hung in the air. Traoré's address, the digital map of pain, the empty chair that had said more than any statement. President Akato sat quietly at the center, notes untouched. When he finally stood, the room leaned in. "I've listened, and I will not pretend to be unmoved." He looked first to the Kenyan flag, then to Traoré, then across the hall. What happened in Kenya is not foreign. It is not far. It is not fiction. It is a reflection. He let the word linger. Reflection. We can debate tax codes and export metrics endlessly, but if one of us burns, we all choke on the smoke. It hit hard. One Tanzanian delegate stopped mid-sip of coffee. A Moroccan minister slid his phone quietly under the desk. "Unity," Akoto continued, "cannot survive without shared responsibility. We cannot be united in ambition and divided in empathy. What's the point of a summit if we won't face our own pain?" Then he turned to the Senegalese ambassador. "You said yesterday that we must find our voice. I ask, what good is a voice that never speaks for the suffering?" The room remained still. Even the translators slowed their pace, respecting the moment. Then came a second voice. The delegate from Rwanda stood, hands folded. His face was solemn, his voice steady. "Mr. President," he said, "we once knew fire." And the room froze. We knew the smell of burning homes. We knew the silence after the screaming stopped. We cried for help, and no one came. We buried our own with no justice. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. So I say this not with anger, but with warning. Do not wait for flames to awaken your conscience. By the time fire reaches your door, the children are already gone. Some blinked away tears. A young aide from Malawi whispered, "God." The Rwandan delegate nodded once and sat. No applause, just breath. Traoré stayed quiet, The movement had moved beyond him now. For the first time in years, the summit felt real. In the back row, the Angolan ambassador jotted down a line. "Today we spoke like nations. Tomorrow we must act like one." Outside, there were no official statements, but the leaks had begun. Ghana speaks truth on Kenya. Rwanda's words shake African conscience. Closed-door session becomes moral reckoning. In Nairobi, crowds gathered outside government buildings. Their signs echoed one phrase: "If one of us burns, we all choke." Inside the summit, the tone had changed for good. No one wanted to talk exports, not yet. Conviction hung heavier than any contract. The Kenyan chair remained untouched, still empty, still present. Day 3 was supposed to be routine. Final approval of the Sahel Oil Pact, infrastructure corridors, defense frameworks. A day of signatures and soundbites. Translators stood ready. Press teams rehearsed. All signs pointed to business as usual. Until Traoré walked in. No folder, no briefcase, just a single folded sheet in his coat pocket, and a look that did not belong to the day's agenda. The moderator from Cairo offered the standard welcome. "We now invite the president of Burkina Faso to present the finalized Petroleum Development Agreement." Traoré stepped to the podium. He didn't call for a projector. He didn't touch the microphone. "I will not be reading that agreement today." Whispers fluttered through the room. "My people did not elect me to sign papers and smile for cameras. They sent me to protect something sacred." He reached into his coat and unfolded a worn photograph. It showed a boy standing barefoot in front of a chalkboard made of scrap plywood, holding a torn notebook like it was a treasure. He said, "This," raising the photo, "is the oil that matters." The room froze. "My people didn't send me here for applause, not for handshakes. They sent me for their children, for protection, for peace, for dignity." Traoré set the photo down on the podium like it was a national flag. "You came expecting numbers. I came with names. Samuel, Zanab, Jean-Paul. Children you'll never read in your economic reports, but they are the future we claim to be building." He looked down at the podium, then back up. "I've reviewed the oil pact. Technically sound, legally sufficient. But morally, it is incomplete." "Every country on this map has wounds," Traoré said. "Even mine. I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to ask. What do we expect to build if we refuse to see what's broken?" He stopped at an image of schoolchildren sitting on stones beneath a roofless classroom. This isn't about blame. It's about courage. The courage to see, the courage to act. The air in the hall changed. Some clapped softly. Others just stared. A few pulled out phones, breaking summit protocol to document the moment. Even the Ethiopian moderator whispered, stunned, "We've never seen anything like this." Traoré turned back to the chair from Kenya, then to the screen. "This map has no borders," he said, "because pain doesn't stop at checkpoints. Hunger doesn't carry a passport, and dignity should never be a privilege." He stepped back and let the room breathe. In the corner, a delegate from Namibia placed his notepad face down. He wasn't taking notes anymore. He was listening. At the back, 2 young aides wept silently. They had grown up in places shown on that wall. Traoré offered one final thought. We are not just nations, we are neighbors. And if we refuse to see each other, we will fall alone. He left the stage without waiting for applause, because he hadn't come to perform. He came to remind them of what they once promised to be. And behind him, the map of African suffering still glowed, dimmed but unforgettable. Delegates sat with pens poised, but no one wrote. Cameras rolled, but even reporters seemed to hold their breath. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood silently at the podium, his hands slowly gripping its sides. He didn't look at notes, he looked straight at the room. "We are not here," he began, "to trade handshakes and headlines." His voice was calm, almost quiet, but it sliced through the air like a blade. "We are here to reclaim what we have allowed to erode, our dignity." The silence that followed didn't feel like diplomacy. It was thick, heavy, settling in the chest like smoke. Then came the line. If African lives do not matter in Africa, then where will they? No metaphor, no flourish, just truth. In the third row, the Nigerian minister dropped his pen. A soft clatter, loud in a room that suddenly felt breathless. To the left, the Senegalese ambassador leaned to her aide and whispered, "He said what we all feel but fear to admit." Traoré pressed on. "We fight for trade routes while our students bleed on sidewalks. We speak of growth while our journalists disappear. We mark independence while foreign forces train our police to fear our own." He looked across the hall. The words weren't accusations, they were grief. "What is sovereignty," he asked, "if we cannot protect our children?" That broke something. Heads turned, posture shifted. Some nodded slowly, others froze, but no one looked away. The Ethiopian vice minister gripped his prayer beads tighter. The South African energy delegate bit her lip. Traoré softened. "My nation knows pain too. I don't speak from perfection. I've failed, I've fallen, but I've also listened." From his coat pocket, he drew out a folded page, Miriam's letter. He held it up briefly, then lowered it without reading. "This reminds me who I work for. Not the banks, not the headlines, but for Samuel and every African child who will never live long enough to vote." He placed the letter gently beside the microphone. "Samuel believed Africa could change, and so do I." The room stayed still. But something had shifted. Not denial, recognition. Eyes met across the floor, small nods, silent acknowledgments, a few clenched fists, not in defiance, but in shared resolve. Traoré continued, "I don't ask for outrage. I ask for accountability. Not statements, but standards. Not shame, but courage." Then he turned his gaze toward the empty Kenyan chair. "I know who should be sitting there, and I know why they're not. Let that empty chair remind us dignity delayed is dignity denied." He stepped back. For a beat, no one moved. Then a few hands clapped, softly, hesitant, unsure if it was allowed. But it grew, slowly, then steadily, not thunderous, but real, measured, true. Traoré didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply walked back to his seat and folded his hands. In the press gallery, a journalist from Côte d'Ivoire leaned into her mic and whispered, "That was not a speech. It was a confession we've all been waiting to hear." Across Africa, in homes, shops, taxis, and cafes, people paused to listen to the replay. And then, across screens, radios, word of mouth, the words began to travel. If African lives do not matter in Africa, then where will they? Words that could not be unheard. Words that would not be forgotten. The red light on the final camera blinked off. Aides motioned to the press. Session over. Gasps stirred across the chamber. Until I see language that ensures we don't just extract oil, but build schools with its revenue. Until there are protections for our rivers and our workers. Until no child is displaced because of what we dig from their soil, I will not sign. A Nigerian delegate stood abruptly. "Captain," he said, "with all respect, this deal took 2 years to negotiate." Traoré nodded. "And how long did it take to bury a boy with bread in his hand?" Silence crashed down again. His voice dropped. "I'm not against development. I'm against forgetting." Then he turned to the Malian and Niger delegates. "We can still move forward, but not like this, not with empty chairs at our table, not with children as collateral." The Malian delegate leaned back, visibly rattled. The Nigerian minister folded his arms, silent, but something in the room had shifted. Traoré closed with one line. "If we can build pipelines across borders, we can build responsibility too." He stepped back. No applause, just stillness. Then slowly, Ghana's President Akoto stood. "He's right," he said. "Let's rewrite it, not as a contract, but as a promise." Delegates murmured. Some nodded, some hesitated. But the air had changed. In the press room, journalists scrambled. "He rejected the pact," one whispered. "No," another replied. "He rewrote its purpose." And in a school in Ouagadougou, students watched the speech on a projector. They didn't understand every word, but they saw the photo on the podium, and they saw their president standing alone. What began as a whisper among aides became the only thing anyone was talking about by mid-morning. A classified folder, stamped in red, had been leaked to 2 major Pan-African news outlets. Inside, internal memos showing that several regional security forces, some seated at the summit, had been asked by Nairobi to assist in suppressing the protests. Requests for riot gear, drones, tactical units, and worse, responses, positive ones. Quiet promises of cooperation in exchange for future influence. By noon, every screen in the press room glowed with headlines. Kenya sought regional help for crackdown. Which African states helped silence the streets? Inside the summit chamber, the air grew heavy with shame. No one spoke. No one moved. Traoré entered quietly, 15 minutes early. No security, no folder. Just the same quiet calm that had unsettled the powerful since day one. Many expected fire, some braced for accusation. But he didn't come to accuse. He came to ask. He stood at the podium and said, "I will not ask who opened the door. I will ask who is ready to walk through it." The room fell into stillness. We now know that when our neighbors cried, some of us reached not for water, but for tear gas. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. These documents are real, but they do not have to define us if we act now. The Nigerian defense minister wiped his brow. The Ivorian delegate tapped his desk nervously. But Traoré didn't falter. I'm not asking for outrage. I'm asking for something harder. Reflection, courage, and a vow. Behind him a screen lit up, not with evidence, but with a single sentence. Never again. Let us turn this shame into a promise. Traoré's voice stayed low. I propose a continental accord. No security assistance between African states without a civilian protection clause. No weapons exchanged without public transparency. And a peer review council, not run by donors, not funded by outsiders, but by us, for us. At first, nothing. Then Ghana's Akoto nodded. I second it. Rwanda raised a hand. I support it with a clause that every family affected be acknowledged by the state, even if justice is delayed. Even Angola's normally guarded delegation signaled assent. But not everyone agreed. Chad's delegate stood. This is reckless, he said. We can't govern each other's security. Traoré responded, calm. No, we can't, but we can choose not to fund each other's fear. Silence again. But it wasn't resistance. It was reckoning. Outside, journalists were barred from the room, but the proposal leaked anyway. Across social media, hashtag never again, hashtag how to protect the people first, hashtag Africa. In Nairobi, students projected Traoré's words onto a government building. Let us turn this shame into a promise. Back at the summit, Traoré spoke once last. History will not remember who leaked the folder. It will remember what we did after we read it. Then he stepped down. No grand exit, no bowed head, just an invitation to follow. On the table before them sat a single page, Continental Principles for Civilian Protection and Transparency. No legalese, no buried clauses, just a clear statement of intent. No African government shall support armed suppression of another's citizens without full public disclosure, human rights oversight, and regional review. It lay between microphones and polished nameplates, unsigned. Some stared at it like a mirror, others like a warning, but no one could look away. It began with a whisper. Near the far end of the chamber, where the quiet veterans of the struggle sat, a retired general from Angola leaned toward his Namibian counterpart. His white hair framed a weathered face, and his thick fingers were stained by decades of oil, soil, and war. He hadn't spoken all summit, only watched. Now he murmured, "This boy, he carries the fire we buried." The Namibian minister looked up. Traoré? The general nodded slowly. We used to speak like this, back when independence still meant something, before suits replaced rifles, before comfort dulled the conscience. His words weren't loud, but those nearest heard them and passed them along. From Botswana to Mozambique, from Brazzaville to Bamako, the whisper caught like an ember. This boy, he has the fire. Not the fire of rage, but of clarity, of memory, of purpose. Across the aisle, a delegate from Sierra Leone folded his arms. He's not wrong. A minister from Burundi tapped her pen and whispered, maybe it's time someone reminded us what we used to stand for. President Akoto of Ghana leaned toward his aide. "Do you remember Sankura?" This one speaks in echoes. Still, Traoré sat in silence, not basking, not grandstanding, watching. Not for applause, but for awakening. Then the Angolan general stood, slowly, without cue. The room quieted. He didn't walk to the microphone. He didn't need to. He spoke in French, but his voice needed no translation. "We have sat in these chairs for decades. We have signed deals. We have raised glasses. But when was the last time we raised our voices for something we could tell our children with pride?" Silence. He held up the proposal. "This is not revolution. This is repair, and we owe it." Then, turning to Traoré, he said, "You didn't challenge us. You reminded us that once we were brave." And with both hands, he signed. One name, one line, one ripple. Mali followed, then Guinea, then Liberia. Not all, but enough. Enough to turn hesitation into momentum. One delegate from Togo shook his head in disbelief. "I didn't think this would happen." Another from Tunisia answered softly, "It's not politics, it's memory. That's what scares them." Outside the summit walls, word spread like wildfire. Footage of the general's words reached students at Luanda University. They gathered around phones, shouting, "He speaks for us!" In Dakar, murals began to appear. Traoré's image beside painted words. Memory, courage, dignity. Back inside, the air had changed. Some leaders still refused to sign, but they no longer owned the room. Traoré stood once more. He didn't thank the general. He didn't declare victory. He simply said, "Now the paper speaks for itself." And he sat. The fire wasn't in his voice anymore. It was in the air. Before the final session began, a photo was slipped quietly into every delegate's folder. No caption, no credit, just an image, high resolution, thick stock. A street in Nairobi, smoke still clinging to the air, and in the middle a lone protester, no older than 19, holding a white banner high. Blank, except for 2 marks. A child's red handprint and a single streak. Blood? Paint? No one could say. But it said more than any speech ever could. When delegates saw the image, silence followed. Some blinked, some stared, some quietly turned it face down, unable to look. The Senegalese ambassador whispered, "Why is it blank?" Traoré, seated nearby, replied, "Because sometimes pain speaks louder than words." Across the room, an aide to Côte d'Ivoire's president covered her mouth, eyes wet. The Gambian delegate stared at the image for a long time, then carefully folded it and slipped it into his pocket, not to discard, but to carry. In Nairobi, the boy from the photo still hadn't spoken to journalists. He didn't need to. He marched silently, holding that banner above water cannons and tear gas. That image moved faster than any press release. Phones, newspapers, projections on buildings. One child's print. One cry, too raw to translate. OAU moderators debated removing it from folders, fearing it might ignite debate, but someone insisted it stay. "It's not politics," someone said. "It's truth." President Akoto raised the photo during closed session. He said, "Whoever placed this here did not come to shame us. They came to remind us." He set the image in front of him. That banner has no slogan because the child who made it is either too young to write or no longer alive to speak. Some delegates looked down. Traoré kept his eyes closed briefly. He'd seen the image before. He was the one who requested it. Rwanda's delegate tapped the corner of the photo. He said, "When I saw it, I didn't think of Kenya. I thought of my own country, of all the banners we never got to raise." The Namibian minister nodded. "It's not a message, it's a wound." The Tunisian health envoy rose briefly. She said, "This is why public health and human rights must sit at the same table." She said no more. She didn't need to. Later, in the press room, a journalist from South Africa whispered as she typed, "The most powerful statement at the OAU Summit wasn't spoken. It was printed in red on a blank piece of cloth." Outside, in the streets of Nairobi, the image multiplied. Thousands marched with white sheets, no slogans, just red stains. Some real, some painted, all of them true. A protester shouted through a battered megaphone, "If our leaders won't write justice, we will hold up the silence until they do." At the summit, the image had already done more than most speeches. Some delegates proposed a formal recognition. Others shook their heads. "No resolution is needed," one said quietly. "It's already spoken." In the back of the room, the retired Angolan general stood silently, banner in hand. He didn't raise it. He simply held it close to his chest, like a memory too fragile for words. When the moderator tried to steer the session back to the economic agenda, the room resisted. A whisper moved across the seats. "Not yet. Let this moment breathe." Traoré stood, but he didn't address the chamber. He looked toward the image, the banner, the blood, the handprint. He said softly, "I don't know your name. I don't know your story. But I promise you, this room saw you." And for the first time that week, no one applauded. Because silence was the message. The summit had stalled. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. A collective pause. A breath no one wanted to be the first to break. The speeches were done, the documents signed, the leaks exposed, the banner seen. But now, everyone was waiting for someone else to say the next true thing. That's when she stood, Fatou, the delegate from Guinea-Bissau. Quiet all week, known for numbers, not emotion. An economist, a strategist, not a poet, and yet, here she was, standing. "I have prepared a statement," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. People leaned in, but I will not read it. The room stirred. "We came here for trade, for infrastructure loans, for regional defense. I came here with a mind full of numbers." She paused, scanning the chamber. "But maybe this is the real business of Africa." She pointed, not to a chart or treaty, but to the photo lying at the center of the table. The white banner, the child's handprint. Dignity. The word struck like flint. "My country is small," she continued. "We have no oil. We don't lead coalitions. We are often forgotten in conversations like this." A few nodded. They understood. But dignity doesn't ask for your GDP. It doesn't care about your alliances. It asks only one question: do you protect your people when no one is watching? Her voice trembled now, not from fear, but from truth. "I've seen children go hungry while their governments signed mining deals. I've watched women walk for hours to fetch water while ministers toast in glass towers. I've heard leaders speak of pride, while their journalists disappear. She stepped away from her desk, heels clicking softly on the marble, eyes locked on the empty Kenyan chair. That seat isn't just a symbol, it's a warning. Near the back, a delegate whispered, "She's not asking for applause, she's asking for honesty." Fatu looked at the Angolan general. "You said yesterday that Traoré carries the fire we buried. Maybe he does, but it's our job to carry it now, not just admire it." She turned back to the floor. "I propose a shift, not in policy, but in purpose. Let every future summit begin not with projections, but with a human report, a reckoning. What have we done to protect dignity since we last met? Who have we failed? What have we learned?" Even the translators slowed down, unsure whether to echo what felt like a prayer. "We must ritualize remembrance," she said, "because what we do not measure, we forget." Then she returned to her seat. She looked once at the paper in front of her, her carefully written, data-heavy speech. She folded it in half, turned it over. "I will not speak from a script, not anymore," and she sat. No applause. They couldn't. The silence wasn't absence, it was reverence. A staffer in the back whispered to his colleague, "This was supposed to be about numbers, but it's about souls now." Fatu didn't smile. She didn't seek the spotlight. She just rested her hands on the table, calm but unshakable. Across the room, delegates began to lean forward, not to debate, but to listen. Because something had broken. Not a system, a silence. It started with a mother. In Nairobi, in a quiet apartment, she placed a photo of her son, Samuel, age 16, gone too soon. Next to it, she lit a single white candle. No signs, no shouting, just a flame and memory. A neighbor saw it and lit one too. Across town, another mother lit 2 candles for her nephews lost during the 3rd night of protests. By midnight, Nairobi's hills glowed with quiet light, and then it spread. In Kigali, students turned off their dorm lights, stood at their windows, candles flickering in their hands. Many had never been to Kenya, but they had their own names, their own grief. In Dar es Salaam, fishermen lit lanterns and let them drift into the sea, each flame a prayer, a protest, a promise. In Bamako, children placed candles in tin cans, one for every classmate lost to silence, to poverty, to violence. By dawn, from Lagos to Gaborone, from Kinshasa to Accra, the continent glowed. Even in cities where the lights flickered, the candles did not. The press couldn't ignore it. The Daily Monitor called it Africa's Night of Light. Lemon Africa called it a movement without words. But the name that endured came from a quiet radio host in Windhoek. They call it protest. I call it grief. But maybe it's something else, too. Maybe it's the quiet flame. At the summit, no one needed a summary. They had all seen the photos. Candles outside courtrooms, on balconies, beside shoes, some tiny, some worn. Many with blank pieces of paper beside them, just like the banner, just like the silence. Traoré said nothing that morning. He simply walked forward, lit one candle, and stepped aside. President Akoto followed, then Fatu, then the Angolan general. Not everyone stood. Some stayed seated, cautious, cold. But none of them looked away. No speeches, no votes, just fire and memory. In some cities, business stopped for 60 seconds. In others, children sat in circles around candlelight, telling stories of those they'd lost. One boy in Niamey struck a match and whispered, "This is for my sister. She died before I could say goodbye." In Ouagadougou, students marched silently from the university gates to the steps of Parliament, candles in one hand, school books in the other. No slogans, no chants, just footsteps. On a rooftop in Johannesburg, a group of elders gathered around a fire pit. One, a retired school teacher, murmured, "We once held torches for freedom. This one is for memory." Back inside the summit, near the main entrance, an OAU staffer placed a quiet display. Candles arranged in the shape of Africa. No plaque, no frame, just flame. Reporters tried to explain it. Was it protest? Mourning? A movement? No answer came because the power wasn't in what was said. It was in what people were allowed to feel. One candle could be dismissed. 1,000 could not. That night, as the summit recessed, Traoré stood by a tall window overlooking the city. Behind him, leaders exited quietly. He didn't speak. He just watched the hills. One light, then another, then the fires. Soft, steady, sacred. Africa was no longer waiting for justice. It was lighting the road toward it. There was no ceremony, no music, no speeches, no flags. Just a long table at the front of the hall, bare except for a single sheet of paper printed in English and French. At the top it read, "Continental Commitment for the Protection of Civilian Life During Domestic Security Operations." Below that, 20 blank lines. No emblems, no sponsors, just space for names. It wasn't a treaty. It held no legal weight. No one would be punished for refusing to sign. It was a choice, and that's what made it powerful. Traoré did not introduce it with fanfare. He simply stood, held the page high enough for all to see, then placed it gently on the table, and sat down. The hall went still. No roll call, no motion. Only that sheet of paper. Then President Akoto of Ghana rose, walked to the table, signed his name. No speech, just a quiet nod toward Traoré. Next came Fatou of Guinea-Bissau. Her heels echoed softly as she walked forward. She signed, and beneath her name added, "For the children whose names were never recorded." Then Rwanda, then the Angolan general, then the Ivorian vice president, one, by conviction, not rank. Some paused before signing, others did not. A few added messages. Mali, we choose to see our people again. Chad, let dignity be our doctrine. Not all signed. Some stared ahead, motionless. Perhaps they never would, but no one pressured them. Because this wasn't about pressure. It was about promise. By midday, 11 signatures filled the sheet. More than expected. Enough to start something. A reporter asked, "Will this become law?" A delegate replied, "It already has in the hearts of those who signed." "No law can force compassion," he said, "but vows shape culture, and culture is what builds nations." Then he rose once more. No African government should ever fear its people, and no African child should ever fear their government. He walked back to the front, lit a single candle beside the list of names, not for spectacle, but because it was necessary. That image, names beside flame, would become the photograph that defined the summit. Not the handshake, not the oil pact, not even the applause, but the vow. Across the continent, schools began reading the commitment aloud during morning assemblies. Radio stations broadcast it daily before the news. In Burkina Faso, a copy was carved into stone and placed at the steps of the presidential palace. No parliament had voted on it, but something deeper than policy had passed. A resolution, not written into law, but into memory, into flame, into a future still being written by the hands of those who dared to sign first. The new building stood quietly at the edge of Ouagadougou. No ribbon, no anthem, just sun-warmed stone, clean chalkboards, and the scent of fresh wood. There were no dignitaries, no speeches, only a hand-painted plaque above the door. École Samuel Wanjiku. No slogan, no politics, just a name. Samuel, 16 years old, gone too soon. Bread in one hand, a book in the other. Gunned down in Nairobi before he could finish the lesson he'd started that morning. The school was built in less than 6 months. Traoré redirected emergency education funds originally allocated for a weapons contract. No press release, no camera crews, just action. This morning, the doors opened. Children gathered in neat uniforms. Parents stood nearby, proud but solemn. They didn't know every detail, but they understood enough. This wasn't just a school. It was a promise, made real. Traoré arrived before dawn. No motorcade, no anthem. Just a gray tunic, simple sandals, and a small, worn notebook tucked under his arm. He took a seat in the last row, beneath the wide shade of an acacia tree. No guards, no aides. Just a quiet man blending into the crowd of parents and teachers. When one teacher finally noticed him, she approached hesitantly. "Captain, should I announce your presence?" He shook his head. "No, this isn't about me." Then he folded his arms, leaned back, and watched. The ceremony began without any politicians or dignitaries. It was led by the children. A girl stepped forward and read a poem in French about courage. A boy followed, telling how his father had lost his job, but still taught him to read at home. Then a teacher read a short biography of the boy's name that now marked the school. Samuel believed in books. He believed in peace. He believed he had a future. So today, in his name, may this school be a place where the future cannot be taken. Some in the crowd wiped away quiet tears. One boy, no older than 10, turned to his mother and whispered, "Will Samuel ever know this is here?" She leaned down and softly replied, "I think he already does." Traoré didn't speak, but his fingers curled gently around the edges of his notebook. After the ceremony, the children were led into their classrooms. Fresh chalk, empty notebooks, globes, maps, the alphabet in both French and Mora. No barbed wire, no metal detectors, just space, just safety. One teacher noticed the man in the back row was still sitting there. She returned and asked, "Would you like to speak to the students?" Traoré was among them. Traoré looked at the school, then shook his head. "They've already said enough." Then he stood, nodded politely, and began walking toward the gate. Before he could leave, a barefoot boy tugged on his sleeve. "Are you the one who made the school?" Traoré crouched beside him and smiled. No, a boy named Samuel made it. I just helped put it here. The boy tilted his head. Is Samuel coming tomorrow? Traoré placed a hand gently over the boy's heart. He already did. And with that, he walked down the dusty road, disappearing into the morning crowd. Back inside, the first lesson began. On the chalkboard, the teacher wrote, La dignité n'a pas besoin du bruit. Dignity needs no noise. And beside the front gate, the OAU Summit's candle still flickered, its flame having traveled across grief, across silence, now lighting the first page of a new chapter. It was the annual United Nations General Assembly, rows of flags, dark suits, translators whispering into earpieces. On the surface, it looked like every other year. Climate, trade, security, reform. Polished words, polite applause. But something in the air had shifted. Everyone had heard about what happened at the OAU Summit, the oil pact that was refused, the candlelight vigils, the voluntary vow to protect civilians, and most of all, the silence that spread across a continent like fire. People expected fireworks now, a fiery speech. Maybe Traoré would speak, or Ghana's Akoto, or Rwanda's quiet but razor-sharp delegate. Instead, something entirely different happened. The moderator read the next item on the agenda. Addressing the use of force in civil unrest, lessons from recent incidents. No country was named, but everyone knew. Kenya, Samuel, the photo, the fire. The African bloc stood. Every delegate, from the Sahel to the Cape, from the Gulf to the Horn. One by one, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Rwanda, Angola, Namibia, Guinea-Bissau. They did not speak. They did not chant. They did not hold signs. They stood still. 60 full seconds. In a room addicted to speeches and sound, stillness hit harder than thunder. Confusion followed. A few reporters whispered. Camera operators zoomed in, expecting motion. The Secretary General glanced at the microphones, unsure if they'd cut out. But then the silence landed. Not at the podium, standing quietly with his peers, hands at his sides, eyes forward. Not a single African delegate moved. Not a smile, not a word. Just dignity, unity, memory. After exactly 1 minute, they sat, together, in perfect synchrony. The next speaker from a European nation hesitated. He looked down at his notes, then back up. I would like to begin, he said slowly, by acknowledging the message we just witnessed. But there had been no official message, no statement to translate. And that was the point. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't explained. It was felt. Across the world, headlines rushed in. 1 minute, one continent, one message. The African bloc's silent stand shakes the UN. Dignity without drama. In Nairobi, the silence was broadcast live in cafes, in classrooms, in living rooms. Mothers reached for each other's hands. Students wiped away tears. Teachers paused mid-lesson and said, "Watch this. This is history." In New York, just outside the UN Assembly, a group of African-American youth stood quietly, holding blank banners marked only with red handprints. No slogans, no speeches, just presence. Inside the building, diplomats from across the world requested copies of the Civilian Protection Vow introduced weeks earlier by Traoré at the OAU Summit. Delegates from Latin America, from Southeast Asia, even from within Europe. A quiet ripple began. The idea of a moral accord, not crafted by lawyers, but by conscience. Later that evening, a journalist asked Traoré, "Why didn't you speak?" He paused, then answered, "Because sometimes silence is the only language power understands, and the only one it can't twist." The journalist hesitated. "What do you hope people heard?" Traoré looked him in the eye. "I hope they didn't hear anything. I hope they felt something." That week there was no official resolution on Kenya. No sanctions. No votes. No formal debate. But something deeper happened. The room learned to listen. And for the first time in a long time, Africa didn't have to shout. It stood still. And the world leaned in. The final interview was filmed in a quiet courtyard behind the presidential residence in Ouagadougou. No podium, no red carpet, just two wooden chairs beneath a neem tree as the late sun spilled gold across the grass. The interviewer, an esteemed journalist from Côte d'Ivoire, had flown in with questions the world was waiting to ask. Why silence at the UN? Why candles instead of coalitions? Why tears instead of treaties? Why a school, not a summit? Traoré arrived early. No entourage, no talking points. A cotton tunic, sandals, and the same calm in his eyes. The cameras rolled. At first the questions were formal. "Mr. President, you've become a symbol across Africa. What do you say to those who think your approach is too emotional, too idealistic?" Traoré looked ahead. "I think politics without emotion is just management. And I wasn't elected to manage pain. I was elected to stop it." Another question. "You chose silence over slogans at the UN. Some called it a missed opportunity." He nodded slowly. "There is nothing louder than silence when it's full of truth. We've shouted for decades, but what made the world stop was when we stood still together." They spoke for nearly an hour, about leadership, about Samuel, about the school that now bears his name, about a vow signed not through force, but through remembrance, about a banner with no slogan, and a map drawn by people, not borders. Then came the final question. If you had one message for the future of Africa, what would it be? Traoré didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the garden wall, where a small group of schoolchildren passed by, laughing, walking home. Some recognized him and waved. One girl held her textbook above her head like a torch. He watched until they turned the corner. Then he spoke. "Africa doesn't need louder leaders. It needs braver ones. Ones who cry when our children fall and rise when our people hope." The words settled like the last stone on sacred ground. The interviewer looked down, his voice caught in his throat. His eyes welled up. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The camera stayed on Traoré's face. Still, steady, honest. Then the screen faded to black. No music, no credits, just one line. "In memory of every child who believed Africa could be better." And then, just silence. A silence deeper than applause. A silence shaped like hope.